Okay, now let's talk to Steve Marshall. He's with Cuba Ventures Corp., and he's here to talk about the do's and don'ts of traveling to Cuba. Hey, Steve, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Hey, Michael.
I bet you're the most popular guy when you're at a party right now, aren't you?
You could say that, yeah. I was, as you know, I was in Cuba for 12 years, and I've been working closely with the island for 20 years. So, all of the recent news in the U.S. is old hat for me right now. But yeah, I guess I am. Yeah.
Is it as much fun there now as it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
You know what? It's actually better now because what's happened is, as you've probably seen, the private sector's been allowed to open. So you have, private restaurants owned by Cubans, run as private businesses. You have the private homes, the bed and breakfasts, which are now operated exclusively by the homeowner. And, Cuba's a communist country, right? So, we had this scenario up until sort of 5-6 years ago where literally everything was run and owned by the government. So, these changes have actually made the whole atmosphere there better and more exciting.
How's the food?
Food is, if you were at one of the government restaurants 5 years ago, you'd probably leave before finishing your meal. But at these private restaurants, as I'm saying, I mean, these guys pull out all the stops, and the Cubans are amazing entrepreneurs. Whether they're in the U.S. or whether they're in Cuba, I'm sure you're aware of that.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about a few of the tips of things you shouldn't do. You say tourists should refrain from driving in Cuba. Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's more the rental car system, and also the if there's an accident, what happens is that in most cases the tourist cannot leave the country until the accident report has been correctly filed, and also the insurance company has decided to pay. And if there are any complications with the accident whatsoever, if something untoward happened, then, there have been cases where tourists have been unable to leave for anything between 3 to 6 months. It's just until they modify that part of the law, it can be quite complicated if you get into an accident. And, the point is in Cuba, unless you actually want to travel across the country, which in this particular case, it's actually less risky than it is in the major cities. But if you're staying in places like Havana or any major city in Cuba, you've got taxis everywhere. You've got the vintage American cars. There's really no need for a rental car, and it's just an unnecessary risk, and that's my opinion. Even though my company rents cars, of course, it's just advice. Specifically to Americans or just about anybody else. Unless you actually absolutely need a rent-a-car, if you're staying in a place like Havana, you just don't need one.
Okay, now let me ask you this. So, I'm a journalist, so I've been able to go to Cuba the whole time if I wanted to. A lot of friends and people I've heard about would go to Canada and would go over to Mexico and then just fly into Cuba and not have their passport stamped. That was pretty common. And then everybody else, almost everybody I knew who went would go on a cultural exchange. It'd be 7 or 8 days. So here's my question. Those options are available in becoming. Can you just go to Havana for 3 or 4 days and just have a great little party and leave? Is that possible yet, like going to any other Caribbean island?
Well, what you have is obviously the latest changes made to the travel restrictions have what is called the general license, which means that if you're visiting Cuba for a reason that would further your education, whatever profession you're in, you can somehow justify that visiting Cuba would assist with your research. And, in many ways, if you actually read some of the text, you only really have to return to the U.S. and make this information public. And you get a lot of people visiting now under the general licenses, and they simply return to the U.S. and just log their their experiences on a blog or on a website, and they've basically fulfilled the requirements.
Okay. Are people beginning to do what I just said? Rather than show up for 8 days or 2 weeks, just show up and check out, Old Town Havana.
Yeah. Well, yes, of course. Obviously, based upon current criteria in the U.S., there's still no ability really to take what we would call a vacation, which would be sort of going to the beach and and hanging out there and drinking pina coladas. An American citizen has to have a fundamental reason, and it tends to be more on a cultural standpoint. People to people is the terminology that's used,
right.
and that is essentially to further the exchange of knowledge and information between Americans and Cubans. That is the intent of the president with those rule changes.
And then, Steve, Cuba Ventures, what do you guys do? And give me a 2-sentence explanation on how people can find you.
Well, Cuba Ventures, obviously CubaVentures.com is a public company quoted on the Toronto Stock Exchange. The company actually owns Cuba's largest digital media network of 432 websites.
Wow.
6 languages, and with 30 million page views a year. This is a collection of websites that were built from 1997 onwards and have been constantly updated in the interim. Now, these websites are obviously becoming very popular in the U.S. We've gone from 11% visitors to 33% visitors ever since President Obama addressed the nation on the 14th of December of 2014.
That was good business for you. Steve, I hate to jump in here, but I'm out of time.
Yeah.
Steve Marshall, okay. Cuba Ventures, great information. I really appreciate your time. We're going to link so that people can find you guys and find you so they can get additional information. Steve, thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it. Coming up,